If you ask most people about Edward VI, they picture a pale, serious boy king, the child on the throne who died before he reached adulthood. But Edward wasn't just a tragic figure. He was England's first Protestant monarch, the centre of two competing political regimes, and the king whose short reign set the direction of English religion for centuries. I'm historian and author Claire Ridgway, and today we're diving into a beginner's guide to Edward VI, his life, his government, his religious revolution, and the dramatic attempts to control England in his name. Edward VI was born on the 12th of October 1537 at Hampton Court Palace, the long-awaited male heir of Henry VIII and his third wife, Jane Seymour. His birth was celebrated across the realm, but tragedy struck almost immediately. Jane died 12 days later, probably of childbed fever, leaving Henry without the wife he adored and Edward without a mother. Edward grew up surrounded by tutors of the highest calibre: John Cheek, Richard Cox, Roger Ascham and Jean Belmain, and they quickly realised he was extremely intelligent. By the age of 12, he was writing treatises on religious controversy, including one arguing that the Pope was the Antichrist. Not your typical schoolboy essay. When Henry VIII died on the 28th of January 1547, 9-year-old Edward became king. Too young to rule, he inherited not just a crown, but a political battleground. Henry VIII's will named 16 executors to act jointly as a regency council until Edward came of age. In theory, they were equals, but in reality, one man moved fast: Edward Seymour, Earl of Hertford, and Edward VI's maternal uncle. Seymour declared himself Lord Protector, took the title Duke of Somerset, and persuaded the young king to sign letters patent, giving him enormous power: the right to make decisions without consulting the council. Somerset essentially ruled England single-handedly. So let's consider Somerset's rule 1547 to 1549, the good, the bad and the ugly. Firstly, the good. Somerset was genuinely committed to Protestant reform. Under him, the first Book of Common Prayer was introduced in 1549. No one was executed for their religion. He tried, although unsuccessfully, to stop rich landowners enclosing common land, which was vital for poor grazing families. He supported social justice and showed genuine sympathy for the poor. He also fought aggressively in Scotland, winning the Battle of Pinkie in 1547. But Somerset had major flaws. He ruled autocratically and alienated the very councillors whose support he needed. He indulged in extravagance, pulling down churches and monastic buildings to construct his grand new Somerset House. His first prayer book pleased nobody: too Protestant for traditionalists, too conservative for Protestants. The prayer book rebellion erupted in Devon and Cornwall. Kett's rebellion broke out in Norfolk over land enclosure. Somerset blundered diplomatically by continuing Henry VIII's costly rough-wooing of Scotland to force a marriage between Edward and the young Mary, Queen of Scots. Scotland turned instead to France, and Mary was whisked away to marry the French Dauphin. By late 1549, the council had had enough. Somerset was arrested, released, arrested again for plotting against the new government, and finally executed in 1552. After Somerset's fall, power shifted to John Dudley, Earl of Warwick, later Duke of Northumberland. He didn't take the title of Protector, and he didn't try to rule alone. In many ways, he was the opposite of Somerset. So let's consider the good of his time as leader. Under Northumberland, peace was made with Scotland and France. The Crown's huge debts were reduced. The disastrous coinage debasement began to be reversed. Expert administrators like William Cecil and Thomas Gresham were brought in. A more strongly Protestant 1552 prayer book was introduced without rebellion. He worked with, rather than against, the Privy Council. He encouraged Edward to take a real role in government. However, he pressured Princess Mary to abandon the Mass. He pushed reforms unpopular with much of the country. He seized more church wealth, land, plate, and endowments. There was tension with Archbishop Cranmer, which stalled canon law reform. And of course, he failed spectacularly in carrying out Edward's dying wishes and keeping Lady Jane Grey on the throne. But he was no cartoon villain. In fact, many modern historians see him as competent, pragmatic, and far more effective than Somerset. And now on to Edward VI himself. Edward may have been young, but he was not irrelevant. He was brilliantly educated, deeply committed to Protestant doctrine, devoted to shaping a more godly England. He was actively involved in reforms, including both prayer books. He was able to understand political tensions. He was capable of standing firm, even against his own relatives. He approved the downfall of both his uncles, Edward and Thomas Seymour. But there were limits to his power, and Edward didn't live long enough to rule fully in his own right. By the winter of 1552-3, Edward was seriously ill, probably tuberculosis or bronchopneumonia. He feared one thing above all, that England would return to Catholicism under Mary. So he wrote his device for the succession, excluding both of his half-sisters as illegitimate, and naming Lady Jane Grey, his Protestant first cousin once removed, as his heir. This was legally shaky. It hadn't passed Parliament, but Edward pushed it through as far as he could, signing letters patent shortly before his death. Edward VI died on the 6th of July 1553, aged just 15. Within days, the succession crisis erupted. Lady Jane Grey held the throne for just 13 days before Mary seized power. Edward's reign is short, but enormously significant. What he left behind: a fully Protestant Church of England doctrinally and liturgically, the foundations of the Elizabethan religious settlement, a powerful Privy Council framework, a growing bureaucratic state, a generation who'd grown up with English worship, English prayer books, and Protestant teaching. He didn't live long enough to rule like an adult monarch, but his convictions shaped the next century of English religion and left a legacy that outlasted the brief Catholic restoration under Mary. So who was Edward VI? A brilliant boy, a committed Protestant, a king ruled by others but not entirely powerless, a monarch whose short life changed the direction of English faith forever. If you enjoyed this beginner's guide, do subscribe, like and ring the bell, and let me know in the comments, how do you see King Edward VI? A tragic boy king or a quiet architect of the English Reformation? Thank you for following me. Take care. Bye bye.